Um, and it's probably not going to be nearly as clever or funny. I just got to admit, I was creatively starved apparently this week. So apologies in advance if you're bored. I'll do my best to keep it interesting still. But all right, well, let's get started here. Church history, vastly oversimplified. If you're here for something about cooking, then you're in the wrong location. So here's what we've covered so far. We covered a lot of material so far. Gone all the way up here now through the Reformation, and now we're into the next topic is the 30 Years' War. And I'm really curious if anybody here has even ever heard of the 30 Years' War. I'm not asking for hands up or anything, but because this is something I'd never even I don't remember learning about until I started reading this book. So hopefully some of this will be interesting new material for you. My usual disclaimers. This is obviously vastly oversimplified. This is taking a huge amount of church history and boiling down into a short period of time. There's a lot that I'm going to leave on the table. I am also not an expert in this. I have not studied this professionally or done any sort of anything school wise or have any accreditation beyond just reading a couple books. And I will always do my best to try to separate when I'm throwing out something that's my opinion versus what's more historically accepted fact. So, all right, disclaimers aside, here's our overall timeline. If you've been following along, you'll notice that we're way over here on the right-hand side now. So we're in the 1500s, getting into the 1600s today. So we come a long ways since we started way back with, Augustine and Constantine and those guys. Um, and where we left off was with Martin Luther in his 95 Theses and his, trial, the Dieta Vims. That's kind of where we left off. So we've kicked off the Reformation, and today we're going to cover, more of the early part of the Reformation. We're going to talk about a lot of war today. Today's War Day, unfortunately, which it was just Veterans Day, so I guess it's appropriate. But today, yeah, we're gonna talk a lot about war, and then we're gonna get into but we're getting into the 1600s now. So we're getting closer to our current time. All right. So last time we had this slide, and this is an overview of the Reformation. It's an overview of the kind of overall um, main themes that the Reformation really that was kicked off by Martin Luther. The first one is just the rejection of papal authority. This idea that the Pope is this person who is in charge of the church. And if you remember back, where did that come from? That came from Leo, and he was the guy that kind of stood up to Attila the Hun, and he stood up to the Vandals, and he kind of like turn that into, along with this argument with the Eastern Orthodox Church, with the Bishop of Constantinople, who was more superior. He just took it to the top and said, "Well, I am superior. I'm the Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome has all the authority." That's where all that came from, and Luther says no. There is no basis for that. The Bible is the source of authority. When he was on trial at the Diet of Worms, he was said, like, you can refute me, that's fine, tell me how I'm wrong, but you have to have a source that's from the Bible, not the Pope says, or Bishop so and so says. Like, that's not authority. My only authority is the Bible. If you can show me how I'm wrong with the Bible, then I will recant, I'll repent, I'll change, but you have to show me from the Bible. And so that's a totally different view. Like, it's always, since Leo, it's been the Pope speaks for God and speaks with the authority of God. So salvation by faith. That was you had that medieval European Catholic view of kind of a works-based salvation, where you had to earn your salvation by doing penance, by doing works that would then kind of counteract their good deeds that counteract your bad deeds, kind of a thing. Um, and and Luther says no, there's no evidence for that in the Bible. In fact, this whole concept, which is the kind of the last point, this rejection of the priesthood, this whole idea where the flow of God's grace, how it flows from the source God through all the pipe work that is the Catholic priesthood down to the priest that you're, doing your confession of your sins with. And then that priest is like the tap that's turning on God's grace and turning. He's like, Luther's like, no, we reject all of that. There is none of that. People have a direct access to God through Jesus. We directly access Jesus. We have direct access to God's grace through the work that Jesus did on the cross. So there's no priesthood. There's none of. He rejected the concept of the celibacy. It's like there's no evidence for that, which, by the way, we didn't really talk about. But the only reason that the early church adopted celibacy, because that dates back to the post-apostolic, like that goes all the way back to the early church. Well, that was something the Catholics just inherited. But that actually came out of Greek philosophy. So during the early church, the Greeks believed that if you had sex that made you stupid. I don't know how else to say it. Like they thought that smart people just abstained, and so if you wanted to be a respected philosopher, you were abstinent. Like that was just by choice. Like that's what you did to be recognized as somebody who's worth listening to. And the early church, in order to try to convince the philosophers of their day to base it, they're the smart, philosophical early Christians um, who were trying to defend Christianity in the realm of logic and in philosophy. They chose voluntarily to also be celibate so that they could be, taken seriously. That's where that came from. So the medieval church just kind of inherited it from the early church, and so that's why, when Luther's looking at the Bible and he's kind of like holding up the Bible and holding up the Catholic Church and he's looking at them side by side, he's like, "Oh, take that out. No, take that out. No, that's not in the Bible. Rip that out." So he really took an axe to the Catholic institutions. Um, by comparing them to biblical institutions. And then finally, of course, this idea that every believer should have access to the Bible in a language that they understand, which is radically new idea because for centuries the Catholic Church had acted as gatekeepers of the knowledge, and they did that by keeping the text in a dead language, Latin, and nobody spoke Latin except for the clergy. And so by doing that, they had control over the information. And they did that because they were concerned that if you just give the Bible in its language to random Joe, that random Joe is going to come up with really crazy ideas. And that essentially you're going to have this explosion of bad ideas, of heresy, and the church needed to control the information in order to control uh, the spread of heresy and bad and erroneous teachings. And spoiler alert, they're kind of right. Like, guess what happens when the Reformation starts handing Bibles to everybody in their language? It kind of gets nuts. Like we've had Luther so far. We're going to talk about Calvin here, but there's going to be a whole explosion of Protestant different, what today we'd call denominations. And it comes out of the fact that you just handed Bibles to every Tom, Dick, and Harry, and they all have a different opinion on something. And so, sure enough, I mean, the Catholics were right. If you hand the Bible to everybody, you're going to get a million different ideas, and it causes this shattering of the unity. Um, so yeah, that did happen. I mean, they weren't wrong, but this was a one of the concepts of the Reformation is that everybody should have access to the Bible and be able to to read it for themselves. All right, so Luther, of course, if you remember, Luther he's out there. He just says, "Look, he goes. He's at the Dia de Worms. He goes put on trial. He defends himself quite eloquently, but ultimately they're like finding him guilty of heresy, and so they turn to the local rulers that where he's living, and they basically say, "Hey, turn him over. We're gonna put him. We're gonna either now it's time for the real trial where we." you know, trial by, torture or, try to get him to recant. And if he doesn't, we'll burn him at the stake as a heretic, right? Go the Jan Hus. If you guys remember Jan Hus, he was a reformer, well, a couple, like 100 years before this, and who was burned at the stake for stuff that he didn't actually say. But he was saying a lot of the same thing that Luther said about the Catholic Church and how it's not biblical and there's no basis for it and blah blah blah. But anyways, after the Diet of Worms, the Prince Frederick III, he has robbers kidnap um, Luther and hides him away inside his castle here at Wartburg, I guess it would be, um, in what's today Germany, and he keeps him there, protects him, hides him. He has a secret room in this castle set up. He's Luther's writing books. He keeps studying his Bible and finding more and more things wrong, and he's very vocal, through his writings. And of course, why? Why did Frederick protect him? Well, because Frederick was one of many, not just, it wasn't just one or two. There were several princes. These were people who ruled a relatively small region in what's, again, today Germany, mostly in today's Germany, Central Europe kind of area. And they didn't like the Pope. They were sick of the Pope. They wanted out from under the thumb of the Pope. They wanted to rule their region the way that they saw fit without paying the taxes to the Pope, without the Pope's interference, without, they were done. And they had been waiting for this opportunity. There was a whole group of them that were like-minded. And Luther shows up, basically dropped on their doorstep. And they're like, thank you, Jesus. We're gonna, protect this guy. This guy's we're gonna ride this train to get out of Pope Town. Um, so that's why now that's why they're protecting him. But of course, this doesn't last forever, because of course the papacy sees Luther as an existential threat because their whole everything is built on their papal authority. Like everything is built on the Pope. All of medieval Europe, like everything since Leo I, it's been built on this concept of the Pope. And so Luther saying, "Hey, this whole papal authority is rubbish." That's existential threat to Catholic Christianity. And so you can imagine that they saw this as a major threat, and so you would expect a very very strong response. Now, if you go all the way back to when we first talked about feudalism and the social contract and the way that the European feudalism worked, it was very specific in that it it had this very kind of unfair, either you were a lord or you were just a peasant, and you had kind of a rough time if you were a peasant. But that structure was enforced by the church. The church had this whole thing that said basically, hey, we're Christendom. Like this is the Christian kingdom. Uh, we have the Pope here who's got direct access to God through the Saint Peter, who was, the Bishop of Rome somehow. Um, and so he's got Peter in his ear telling him exactly what God wants to do. And then the Pope is going to tell that to the archbishops and the cardinals and the dukes and it gets down through not the dukes, but the bishops eventually. And then the bishop is going to be in charge, speaking to your king or your local lord or whoever it is that you're under in this, feudal structure. And so there's this idea with Christendom that you have this perfect, utopic, God-driven, God-led structure. Society itself is exactly the society that God wants. And so, yeah, So what does the church get out of that, right? The church gives the authority or the legitimacy of the rulers. That's basically what the church provides. Tells the people to stay in your lane, be a good peasant, and serve your Lord. And in return, the Pope gets physical protection from the he doesn't have an army. He doesn't have he doesn't really have. He kind of has land. He doesn't have an army, so physical protection gets handed over by the rulers that he gives legitimacy to. So of course, what does the Pope do when there's somebody in these Germanic lands who's like protecting Luther? He calls up the top boss in that land, which is the Holy Roman Empire, which we'll talk about in a minute. So he calls up the Holy Roman Emperor and says, "Hey, Emperor, you gotta deal with this. Like, I want him in chains, I want him in custody, or I want him dead. One of the other. Just deal with this. You need to silence this. This needs to end." So what is the Holy Roman Empire? Well, that's a whole story in of itself, and I don't want to go through that because it's not really that pertinent. Just understand that here's a map of the Holy Roman Empire in 1356. So this is about 200 years before what we're talking about here. Um, the Holy Roman Empire, it's kind of a continuation of the Western Roman Empire. Now, if you remember, the Western Roman Empire collapsed after the sacking of Rome by the Vandals. That's where the emperor was basically was murdered by his guards and thrown out in the streets. The entire government collapsed. Those who didn't flee the city were taken as captives, and the church, the Catholic Church, steps in and basically fulfills the role of government in the city of Rome. But that means that basically the Western empires it's collapsed. And in that power vacuum that's left, you get the feudal system rises up out of those ashes, and you have this feudal pyramid where it starts with a bajillion, I mean, just thousands of these little counties that are ruled by like one local person. And then over time, the pyramid gets taller and taller. That feudalistic pyramid gets taller and taller. At the bottom are all these dozens of hundreds of individual little blobs. Just like on this map, there's all these tiny little blobs. Each one of those is a principality where some dude is in charge of that region. Or even some of these are actually themselves little pyramids where there's like somebody in charge of that, but then there are sub people underneath that, and it's layers and layers of pyramids. It's pyramid scheme everywhere. And this doesn't show like Kingdom of France. It looks like a big blob there. Kingdom of Hungary. No, they look like this if you open the hood under France. It's just layers and layers of pyramids and anyway, you get the idea. But at some point, I think it's in the 800s, there's a guy named Charlemagne, and he's like a French guy who basically starts conquering a whole bunch of land, and he basically declares himself not just a king but an emperor. So he's now created a new rung on the pyramid. He basically took a whole bunch of pyramids where kings were at the top, conquered a whole bunch of them, and then basically said, "Okay, now I'm one more layer up. I'm an emperor." And the empire that I'm an emperor of is the Roman Empire. He basically harkens back to Rome itself to try to say, like, I am the emperor of Rome. And over time, it migrates and it changes shape. But this is where most of it is, most of the time, is this like Central European, where this map shows from northern Italy to France to kind of Poland, Hungary. Most of what's Germany today, most of it is what's Germany, and that's a good approximation of what the Holy Roman Empire. And it changes shape and it gets bigger, smaller, but that's not important. The thing that's interesting about there's two really interesting things about the Holy Roman Empire. One is that most of the big kingdoms that arise, because this whole period of time that we've been talking about, from the fall of Rome up until the Reformation, what you have are the pyramids growing. And so you have France being assembled by eating and getting a bigger and bigger, and more of these pyramids get subsumed onto one big pyramid with the king of France at the top. But the French kingdom, it has one thing in common, and that's French culture. There's French language, French culture, French food, French festivals, French. It's French. The culture is what's kind of unifying around that. Same for Hungary, same for England, same for Poland. Like you have the culture is kind of what's constant. And of course that's not hard, that's not a hard truth. There's bleeding of cultures and things. But what's interesting about the Holy Roman Empire is that it represents a hodgepodge. That's what was unique about what was his name? Charlemagne. What he kind of accomplished was taking French and Germanic and Dutch and all these different types of cultures and unifying them under one rule. And my opinion, when if you remember back at Constantine, when he selected Christianity after he won his or like even before he won his battle, he selected Christianity as his emperor cult. And at the time, I said, in my opinion, I think what Constantine was trying to do was trying to find something that would act as a glue to hold the Roman Empire together. Because the Roman Empire was very diverse. It had lots of cultures, lots of things. And the Romans had traditionally used uh, force and like fear and oppression to kind of hold the empire together was its main source of cohesion. But with all of the wars that would break out every time there was a succession, I think Constantine was looking for something else. Just my opinion, but I think what Charlemagne pulled off in the 800s is essentially what Constantine had in his vision. He envisioned a Roman Empire that was held together by religion. And I think that's what the Holy Roman Empire represents. So that's the first thing, is that it's very diverse culturally. But the second thing that's interesting about it is almost all of these kingdoms, they're all hereditary. You have the king, and then his son becomes the heir, who then after the king dies, the prince becomes the king, and then so on, and it's just handed down from generation to generation inside one family line. The Holy Roman Empire was unique in that it actually had electors. There were, and you'll see some of these, like the electorate of Bohemia there, kind of in the middle. Those were the really big or really politically important members of the Holy Roman Empire. If you were kind of the top rung of the pyramid, it was actually not really a pyramid. It was actually kind of a flat structure. And those at the top, they were electors. And those electors then voted and elected the Holy Roman Emperor. And that Holy Roman Emperor uh, served until death. But then when they died, it wasn't handed to their heir. It was reelected. And so the fact that you have kind of this flat pyramid with the emperor who then is elected instead of like hereditary, it's just a very unique structure within Europe. So that was the other really interesting thing about it. But so anyway, the whole point of that was just try to give you a background on what the heck the Holy Roman Empire is and why I'm talking about it. What's important about it is because the Pope, Luther's here. Like, where's Waldo, right? Like, get your magnifying. He's in here somewhere. So the Pope says to the Holy Roman Emperor, "Hey, you got to do your job. Like, your job is to enforce, and this is an enforcement thing. So." He's been found guilty of heresy. He needs to be taken into custody. He's in your land somewhere. Get on it and make it happen. Okay. So, and it doesn't take the emperor very long to figure out that some of his dudes are protecting him, right? And so when he starts cracking the whip, the people who are saying, basically a war breaks out inside the Holy Roman Empire. And this is a lovely map that kind of shows the purple regions are the whole section of princes that all banded together in what's called the Schmalkald League, and all the pronunciations are wrong or your money back. It's my guarantee. So there was a war. The Holy Roman Empire fought against members of the Holy Roman Empire called the Schmalkald League. And this was for 9 years. And you would think that this would be because of the magnitude of this. This is, again, Luther is an existential threat to Catholicism. You can bet that the Pope was profoundly interested in snuffing this out and killing it as soon as they could, because the longer this went on, the more power and more authority, and the farther his message spread, and the more he wrote, and it's just becoming a snowballing problem for the Catholic Church. So they are like, let's get it done. But surprisingly, this war, it's kind of it, the Catholic Church doesn't the Catholic side doesn't really get all behind it. And the reasons for that are very complicated and they're outside the scope, but it has to do with politics. There was a bunch of Catholic countries that were also kind of sick of the Pope, and so they were kind of like not that excited about, stomping out Lutheranism. Some of them were just busy. Look at the years, like, 1492, Columbus scaled the ocean blue, right? So the new world is a new thing. And so England, France, Spain, Portugal, all these countries are frantically trying to explore, colonize, and exploit the New World. And they're fighting each other over that. So they're busy. And so, for a bunch of different reasons, somehow this Schmalkald League, they don't really win, but they kind of win just by default. Like the only way they could lose is if they got completely wiped out. And they didn't get completely wiped out. And so they kind of fought them to a stalemate, and that's a victory for them. And the end result is something called the Peace of Augsburg. So that was an agreement that was signed that basically says that the local prince can decide if their region is going to be either Catholic or Lutheran. This is huge. Basically, that legalizes a second flavor of Christianity. Now, the smart among you, which is like all of you, by the way, I think all highly of all of you. No, I won't even say it. All of you are probably saying, wait a minute, Tom, there's already a second flavor of Christianity called Eastern Orthodox. And yes, you're correct. But Eastern Orthodox and Catholic are so different that they don't really even consider the other one Christians. So from a Catholic perspective, from a European perspective, the entire society is built on the concept of Christendom, where there's this one right way to do things, and it's all being driven by God, and God's providing the guidance, and the society that you live in is the perfect utopic society because God is leading it. And that's why you should obey and get in line and do what you're supposed to do as far and not make not to shake the tree any and not to be a rebel or anything evil like that. But now all of a sudden there are two right answers for how to be the perfect utopic Christian kingdom on earth. And they're very different. Like just like Eastern Orthodox and Catholic are very different, Lutheran and Catholic are very different. So and people didn't realize it at the time, but this is a deadly blow to the concept of Christendom. But Christendom's not going to die yet. It's still got quite a bit of life in it. But this is like the mortal blow. This is the like it Christendom is wounded, but it's got to bleed out for a while before it actually dies. But this is the mortal blow, is this Peace of Augsburg. But there's also a problem with this piece, and that is because it says nothing about Calvinism. So we have to do a little rewind. Okay, we got to back it up a few years, and we got to talk about a guy named Calvin. Notice the years here: 1555. That's when this Peace of Augsburg kicks in. Okay, back it up. Um, Back in 15, I think it's 15. I didn't write it down. I should have put it in here. That's his birth years, not birth and death years, but I think it's like 1540s is when this guy Calvin shows up. So, you know, 10 or so years before the or just before the war breaks out. He's a French Protestant. He's a thinker. He's a scholar. He's a smart dude. He's in France. France isn't necessarily a very welcoming place for Protestantism because it's very heavily Catholic. So he's on his way to somewhere in Germany, and because of like a war that's going on, one of the like constant wars that are just part of feudalism, the road to the city he's going to is blocked off. So he goes the long way and he ends up in Geneva, which is today part of Switzerland. And Geneva, and he's just stopping by. It's just on his way, right? He's on his way to somewhere else. But Geneva at that time wasn't like part of any kingdom, it was kind of a independent state and just a city state by itself. Like think of Athens or Corinth or something in the ancient Greek world. Like that, it's kind of like a city state. And the guy in charge, he was looking for somebody to to be like the head spiritual dude of the city of Geneva. So he has Calvin walk into town, and he's like, "Hey, I heard you're really smart. How'd you like a job?" And Calvin's like, "No, I'm busy. I'm on my way. I got other plans. Thanks, but no thanks." And the guy like guilts him into it. He's like, "God sent you here, and you're supposed to be here. You'd better not offend." And he guilts him into doing it. So he gets hired, and for reasons we'll get into in a minute, he doesn't do very well. He actually, after like 2 years, gets run out of town because the people just didn't like what he was saying. He had a very high emphasis on personal morality, which we'll get to in a minute. But he gets run out of town. He goes to some other town, but then for reasons, eventually he comes back to Switzerland, to Geneva, and he ends up staying there. And he has a very successful, very long-term stay in Geneva for like 20 plus years. He's in Geneva teaching, writing, and he has a different view of Protestantism. So if you remember when Luther, when he sits there, when he has his like epiphany, he's reading about God and grace and it's about faith. That was his thing. It was faith. It's about faith in God, and faith is the thing. So everything that he does is shaped around this concept of faith. Calvin, his like epiphany kind of driving concept is the total and absolute complete power of God, the sovereignty of God. The idea, the Bible says like not, a sparrow doesn't fall from the sky without God knowing what it is. He knows the hairs on your head or whatever. Like for Calvin, he looks at the world and he sees God in everything that happens, every raindrop that falls out of the sky is being held there by God, is like moving that individual raindrop down. He has this complete view of the authority and power of God. Nothing happens except for by God's direct action, which if you take which and he takes this to the maximum extreme. And if you do that, it has some very interesting consequences for theologically. Like, for example, you got up and I don't know, probably picked a pair of socks. Like one of the things I got to, you open the sock drawer, you look at your socks and you go, okay, which pair of socks am I going to wear today? Sometimes this is a harder choice than others, but you pick a pair of socks. In Calvin's view, you didn't make that decision. God made that decision. You decided, to how to comb your hair. God decided that. Every decision you've made, everything thought you've ever thought, every action you've ever taken, God did it. You are an actor on a stage. You are reading a part. You are acting out this play that God's already written and scripted. And the concept that you make any decisions, that you have any authority or power in your life is complete illusion. That's the consequence of how much power and authority God is exercising in Calvinistic view. Now, this means this has some really weird effects. One is that it results in this very extreme view of predestination. And predestination shows up in the New Testament. Paul talks about it in very strange and confusing things that I don't understand. But there is this word, the elect. Like there's a scripture that says something about like, the somebody trying to fool the elect as if that was possible, something like that. And so Calvin latches onto that predestination concept and just takes it to the nth degree and says that, yeah, you're either the elect or you're not. And do you know if you're the elect? No, you don't know. Nobody knows. Only God knows. We don't know who's elect and who's not. But we have some pretty strong ideas on who isn't the elect. We might not know for sure. But obviously, if you've never been baptized or don't believe in Jesus, or, you live in a hut in the middle of Africa and have no idea who even Jesus is, obviously you're probably not the elect. So we can probably just skip those people. But obviously we don't know if you're an elect or not. But if you go to church regularly, if you participate in the sacraments of baptism and of communion, and you live a high moral life, if you live a Jesus-like morality life, you're probably saved. You're probably among the elect if you do that. That is actually Calvinism. Even today, that's Calvinism, which I find very interesting. But what happens is you have this extreme emphasis on morality. Like, we, if you remember, we lost that after Constantine opened up the church for any convert whatsoever, and the church got flooded with people, and they couldn't actually convert people because they used to actually convert people, and part of that conversion was moral change, like moral, like you had to repent. And so now this is actually kind of a return to that. Like here you have somebody who's teaching that if yeah, you could mail it in, you could do the bare minimum, but are you really the elect? Are you sure you're the elect? You don't know that for sure. You really should have a very high standard of morality if you want to be sure that you're the elect. And so that's actually why he got run out of town in the first place, is people were not ready for that. And so, but eventually, yeah, he did. And so but again, he still believes in the idea of Christendom. So in his view, he is leading the city of Geneva, this whole city of people, and he's teaching them that you need to have this high standard morality. Everybody's got to be a part of this. If you're not a part of this, you're not, kind of hit the road. But this leads to a very high standard of morality. And I want to read straight out of Shelley because he explains this better than I ever could. So I'm just going to read quote verbatim out of what he writes here to kind of like explain how this works. It says, man is not justified by works, yet no justified man is without works. Okay, this is, by the way, this is Shelley's words, not Calvin. I'm not quoting Calvin. I just want to be really clear because it sounds like I'm quoting Calvin. No, this is how Shelley's trying to explain what Calvin would say to defend his works. Okay, so man is not justified by works, yet no justified man is without works. No one can be a true Christian without aspiring to holiness in his life. This rigorous pursuit of moral righteousness was one of the primary features of Calvinism. It made character a fundamental test of genuine religious life and explains Calvinism's dynamic social activism. God calls the elect for his purpose. So that's just trying to summarize like the Catholic the Calvinistic movement put this very high standard of morality. I don't remember my and one more thing I want to say. The other element that's really unique about Calvinism is this emphasis on it's very anti-authoritarian. So Calvin, because he sees that God is in ultimate control, God's controlling everything, he kind of consequently, every time he sees where one person claims to have this total authority, he's kind of like, no, no, you're trying to claim God's authority. You don't have. So the Pope, no, you're taking the role of God. Kings, there was a king who claims total, authority. No, sorry, you shouldn't have. In Calvin's view, because God is in control, we should not, there should never be one person in charge of everything. So he was a very anti-authoritarian, which is amazing in an era where everything is authoritarian. The church structure is authoritarian. The civil governments are authoritarian. Everything's authoritarian. We haven't seen any sort of non-authoritarian structure since the Republic, Roman Republic, which was like, 100 years before Jesus, right? So it's been a long time. It's been, almost 2,000 years since we've seen a non-authoritarian structures in society. So this was very different. And what it ends up causing is um, Calvin, of course, is based in Geneva, and he's very safe and protected there. But what he's drawing in all these people who are reading his works and are interested. They come from all over to Geneva. They spend time in Geneva, and they are like, "Whoa, this is amazing! This is the society. This guy's got it figured out." And they all go. They end up going back to their home countries, and end up being kind of agitators for reform. For they want social say. They want democracy. Um, we actually have Calvin to thank for the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The concepts there are directly out of Calvinistic teachings about rule for the people by the people. That started in the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, but we have Calvinism to thank for that. That he kind of led the way on that in a lot of ways. And not just him, there's other philosophers and stuff too. I'm not trying to give him all the credit, but it's just fascinating that in this world of authoritarianism, he is this very strong anti-authoritarian, and it makes Calvinists this very much a um, they're reformers. They're agents of change. They are trying to make things change their world. And I want to kind of like put Calvinism side by side with the medieval church. We've seen this medieval church doctrine before. Salvation by works through penance, societal conformity enforced by the state, infant baptism. So there's no conversion concept. You are born into it. You are part of it. It's a societal structure, not necessarily something you like choose to join. It's like you're either part of society or you're out. And low standards of personal behavior, but high standard of conformance. Calvinism is in a lot of ways an inversion of the Catholic Church. It's anti-authoritarian. It's salvation by of the elect, which is a lot more like a voluntary thing. It's much more of an idea that there's an emphasis on your personal righteousness, and that's a sign of your electedness. And so you choose to be a righteous person to show that you're part of the elect. That's very different than the Catholic view. And of course, it's anti-authoritarian, which of course the Catholic and the whole social construct was very authoritarian. All right, I think how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm doing great for time. Okay, so what happens when you throw Calvin into the mix? Well, you end up with, and it's not just Calvin. You have a lot of things all coming together, and I don't have I think I have a slide on this, but this you've got a whole bunch of things causing an age of civil warfare. That's kind of like what happens next. So you have, and again, religion is just one piece. You have the growth of a middle class. Before in the feudalistic society that's most of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages of Europe, you have the lords and the peasants, and there's like nothing in between. But over time, as technology advances, as society advances, you start getting a growing middle class somewhere they're not landowners, they don't have like political authority, but they have some education and they have some money. Not a lot, but they're not peasants anymore. And when you have people in that kind of middle class, they tend to want to the education tells them they get kind of like, well, I know what's going on, and they also having money means that you want to have a say in that money. I want to make more money. I want to make sure somebody doesn't take my money. Like they want a say in society. They want a say in government. And so you have this growing middle class that is um, creating a change in the world. You have money. The world starts running on money. In the medieval, more the earlier medieval age, when people were people had to pay basically taxes. Like if you were a peasant, you basically were a farmer working at some piece of land, and you had to pay taxes on that land. Usually it wasn't money, it was like whatever crop that you grew. Like you basically gave a portion of your crop to. So like there wasn't a lot of money being handed around. There was, but there wasn't a huge amount of money. Money wasn't really the main thing. But that starts to change in the late Middle Ages, in the early Renaissance. By the time the Renaissance, the area that we're talking, the era we're talking now, money is a big thing. Money makes the world go round. Money makes the political world go round. Money makes the religious world go round. Money, money, money. It's the world that we live in, quite frankly. So we should be really familiar with that idea. Um, there's new ideas. I talked about it, I think, last time. One of the consequences of the Crusades was that the Europeans got in contact with the Muslims. And in the Muslim world, they had records of the ancient Roman world, of the ancient Greek world, of the ancient Egyptians. They had their own philosophy and art and science and things that they were doing. And Europe had lost all that. Nobody knew what the Iliad was, or any of the ancient Roman philosophers or poets. That had all been lost. And the church had always been the gatekeeper of any sort of knowledge and philosophy. If you wanted to be a philosopher, if you wanted to be a writer, you wanted to be a thinker, everything you did had to go through the church for its official approval. And if you said anything that was out of line or was controversial, like you didn't publish it or you got burned at the stake as a heretic. So the church controlled ideas, and there were not very many new ideas that came along as a result. After you have the Crusades and all of this contact with the Muslim world, these ideas start coming back into Europe, and because of the kind of the degrading of the authority of the church, this is what causes the Renaissance. Like we talk about the Renaissance as an artistic. If you look at the paintings, the sculptures during the medieval era, they look like kindergarten finger painting. You look at like the ancient Roman and ancient Greek sculptures, and they're amazing. And all of a sudden, you get back to the Renaissance, and it's like they rediscover. That's the whole like part of the Renaissance is rediscovering painting and rediscovering artwork and philosophy and poetry and so all these new ideas come flooding back in. Some of them old ideas, but they're all new ideas that are causing this change in society, which is going to cause conflict. And of course, religion. We've already talked about that. You have Catholics, you have Lutherans, and now you have Calvinists in the mix too. And the Calvinists are the ones that are like, they're kind of subversive and activist. So that kicks off a whole bunch of civil wars, and I don't have time to go through all of them. Nobody has time to go through all of them, quite frankly. There's a lot of wars that go off, but let's talk about a few big ones. So France, there were people inside the nobility that got caught the Calvinist disease, and so they actually tried to kind of overthrow the French government and make it Calvinist. And those French Calvinists are called Huguenots. And so there's like a Canadian football team, I think that's the Huguenots, and that's what that it represents is the French Calvinists. Um, and a lot of them fled to Canada, to the New World. That's why they're there, right? That's why the Canadian team's there, because they were persecuted because they failed. They tried to, but there was a big slaughter, and anyway, but they failed. So France is in the fully in the Catholic camp. Um, the Netherlands, though, there's a guy named William the Silent, who's also known as William of Orange. And if you know today, the Dutch, like their national color is orange because of this. He led an actual successful rebellion against Spain because for some reason Spain was the like people in charge of what is today the Netherlands. And that was the result. Then they ended up with a Dutch republic, which was um, a beginning of an early it was the precursor to the Dutch Republic, so it wasn't a democracy yet. But like again, Calvinists, so they're putting in these institutions that will later become uh, what we would consider modern democracies. Scotland's really interesting because there's a guy named John Knox who's a Calvinist. He kind of leads this revolt in Scotland, which means this really weird thing where you have essentially the people are all Calvinists, but their ruler is Catholic. And you heard of Mary, Queen of Scots, like she was the Catholic ruler of Scotland, but her people were all Calvinists, and it caused all sorts of problems and warfare and again, there's a fascinating history there, but John Knox is seen as a hero in Scotland today. Um, anyway, and then England, of course, England has it's a whole chapter in the book, and that's Henry VIII. Yeah, that song. That's the Henry VIII, the guy who he was married to the Queen of Spain. Like he married his wife was associated with the Spanish royal family, and he needed an heir, and she was not producing any kids. And so he finally went to the Pope and said, "Hey, I want an annulment. I want out of this marriage. I want to marry somebody else. This really hot thing around the corner, Anne Boleyn, um, and she's going to give me kids, and it's going to be great. But I need an heir, and this woman's not doing it. So I want an annulment." And the Pope, who's the Catholic or the Spanish the Spanish kings and queens were very pro Pope. They were very Catholic, and they were some of his strongest supporters. So he said, "No, I'm not going to give you one." So Henry VIII says, "Okay, bye Pope. Hey, Archbishop of Canterbury, guess what? Now you're the Pope of my new religion called Anglicanism. So now I'm founding the Anglican Church. We're now Anglicans, and it's basically this weird hybrid of Catholic because there's the Archbishop of Canterbury who's basically the Pope, and a bunch, but we're going to mix in a bunch of random Protestant ideas, and it's this weird hodgepodge. And he did that so that that he could get an annulment of his marriage and marry somebody else. Um, and that's a whole fascinating story too. But again, it's war. War breaks out over this. Like people are fighting over this. So there's just war going on all over the place. Um, but all of those wars are just the warm-up act. This is just we're not even scratching the surface of the 30 Years' War. And as you can imagine, the 30 Years' War lasts for 30 years, which is a long time. It's not the longest. There was like the English and France fought like 100 Years' War, which is absurd. But they also didn't share a land border very much. So there was like, anyway, not important. I'm getting distracted. The point I do want to make is that the 30 Years' War was a thing. It was a big deal, which is fascinating because I hadn't really heard about it until I studied this. But this is essentially World War Zero. Like this is World War One before it was World War One. Like actually, the parallels between this and World War One are utterly fascinating because if you know World War One, you've got Archduke Ferdinand, some random archduke gets assassinated in Sarajevo by some random terrorists. And next thing you know, that just snowballs almost overnight into the entire of Europe just throwing armies at each other. And millions and millions of people die, and huge swaths of countryside are destroyed and ravished. And it's this absolutely cataclysmic, very traumatic event. The 30 Years' War is the exact same thing. It starts with like these two little principalities that are tiny and kind of insignificant, and they end up going to war over a whole series of issues. And if you want to get the full story, there's a really good YouTube video um, that went through like all the causes and all the things about it. And it's really so if you're really interested, I recommend going looking that up. But it's over economics, it's over politics, it's over religion, it's over all sorts of reasons. But it starts with this little fight between these two principalities, and it kind of snowballs. And religion's a part of it. Some people there's Calvinists that are a part of it. There's like the Holy Roman Emperor wants to have everybody go back to Catholicism. You've got Lutherans that are like, heck no. You got Calvinists that are like, what about us? Like they're all anyway. So it's a mess. It's just a mess. And it snowballs into a massive conflict. And one of the things that's fascinating about this is they've calculated that at the end of the day, somewhere between 4.5 or 8 million people were killed, and almost all of those are civilians. These are just the farmers and people living in little countryside villages. And because you had these armies just marching one side or the other, they would go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth because this war just went on, and nobody was ever getting an upper hand, and people bowed out, and then another country would jump in because, I mean, why not? Sweden at one point jumps in. It's a whole thing. It's fascinating. It's a really interesting history, but it just goes on and on. And one thing about warfare at this time, you didn't have huge standing armies. Like you didn't have like the nation of whatever had this massive army of professional soldiers. What they did is they had a very, very small group of professional soldiers, like maybe a couple hundred. But then they would be able to call up thousands of their peasants and basically hand them a spear and a sword and say, hey, or a spear and a shield and say, okay, now you're soldiers now, go fight. But they couldn't keep them in the field for very long because they were farmers and they needed to actually farm and collect the food, and otherwise everybody was going to starve. So what the biggest weapon was mercenaries. During this time frame, you have massive mercenary armies that are just for hire. They're just an army for hire, and you, and you had the money. You could hire them to go fight your wars for you, and that was the main way you fought wars at this time was through mercenaries. But mercenaries were very expensive. And one of the reasons this war was kicked off was over economic failure. Like there was a whole bunch of economic madness going on. So people are pumping their money into these mercenaries and they run out of money and they can't pay them. Well, the mercenaries don't just like go home. What they do is they say, well, okay, if you're not going to pay me, I'll take my pay out in other ways, in a creative ways, shall we say. So as they're marching through these towns and villages and fighting, when they want to get paid, they just break into somebody's house and take their stuff. Um, and if somebody ever tries to stop them, they just kill them. And so you have mass pillaging, you have mass murder, it's just awful. Like it's just awful. I don't know how to put into words how awful this was. 4.5 to 8 million people, which doesn't sound a lot today because we've had wars that killed way more than that. But considering the population density of Europe at the time, that's almost 50%. 50%, like half the people. Like there's accounts of somebody who comes into a town after a battle and it's a ghost town because everybody's dead. There's like 2 or 3 people left. Everybody else is dead. It's just mass murder. It's just awful. And just for context, World War II, Russia lost millions. I don't remember how many millions of people Russia lost. And it's a very trauma. To this day, Russia is traumatized societally. By the entire country is
25.
traumatized.
25 million.
95 million. Thank you, Maria. Uh,
25.
25 million. But that represents 17% of their pre-war population. This was 50. This is this is what Russia went through in World War II, which was awful and traumatic and double that. Like that's how bad this. Okay. Hopefully I made the point. This is traumatic for Europe, not just for these people, but for Europe. And the war ends not because somebody wins. The war ends because everybody's just exhausted. Nobody's making any headway. Everybody's dead. Nobody can pay the armies anymore. It's just they just give up at the end, and they end up signing what's called the Peace of Westphalia. And this is one of the most important peace treaties in history. And at the end of the day, it says that the local rulers can decide the religion of their regions. Now, if you're kind of going, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. Isn't that what the Peace of Augsburg said? Yeah, it's basically the Peace of Augsburg, but instead of having um, Catholic and Lutheran, it's basically Catholic, Lutheran, and fill in the blank. You write in vote. Like whatever. We don't care what you do. Pick something, but the ruler gets to decide. So this basically, Peace of Augsburg, it basically said, now we have two legal religions, Catholic or Lutheran. The Peace of Westphalia says anything's legal. We don't care. It's fundamentally what Europe is saying is that we don't care. It's not worth fighting over. Religion is not worth fighting over. We've done that. It was just a disaster. It was traumatic, and we're done with that. And this represents, in my opinion, I'm going to throw my opinion out there again. In my opinion, you have this is this is where Europeans in general gave up on the church, gave up on Christianity. Like this started a downward decline in how Europeans view Christianity that I'm not sure we've hit the bottom yet. Like to this day, people are still traumatized by the 30 Years' War, is my opinion. It's still it baked into the European psyche that religion is not something worth fighting over. It's not worth dying over. It's not important. And it's decayed in importance ever even till today. You still have, I think, we're still trying to see have we hit the bottom yet in Europe. Anyway, but the real, oh, I'm over time. Dang it. Thank you for staying with me. You were all excited. You're like, man, he's gonna be done early. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not done early. Um, but here's the real lasting impact is that this is the death knell of Christendom. The concept of Christendom is now dead. The idea that there's this one right way and, our group has got it figured out and we're gonna like be this utopia that society's built around. No. The Peace of Westphalia says that's dead, and it introduces a new idea, denominationalism. And denominationalism fundamentally says nobody has it all figured out. The Catholics don't have it all figured out. The Lutherans don't have it figured out. The Calvinists don't have it figured out. The Puritans don't have it figured out. We haven't talked about the Anabaptists haven't figured it out. We haven't talked about there's a whole explosion of groups too. We've just focused on three, but none of them have it figured out. They all have something right and they all have something wrong. That's what denominationalism says. So you do what you do, I'll do what I do, and we'll just not kill each other for it. How about that? That's denominationalism. That's the world that we live in today. And that's what the Peace of Westphalia brings in. Also, I found this picture. The title is Allegory of the Peace of Westphalia. And I have absolutely no idea what's going on in this. So I present it without comment. And that's all I got for today. Thank you for letting me stick a little bit long, a couple minutes over. But yeah, that's the lesson for today. Next time we'll get into the last section, last one. We're going to carry this concept now. What happens with when Europe, after the Peace of Westphalia, after the concept of Christendom dies, denominationalism now takes over. What's going to happen? We got the New World. What's going to happen? Uh, that's going to be next time. So, all right. Thank you very much. Feel free to stick around a few more minutes. I'm going to cut off.